class taught by my good friend and colleague Shadman Bashir that deals with war and terrorism. And the reason why we've kind of garnered a little bit of media attention with this is because Shadman has this very special guest joining us to talk about war and terrorism and other issues, I'm sure, and having to do with how we're governed. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about a program that's coming to light that I just wanted to shed a little bit of light on in terms of global studies here at Dixie State University. This is all in an effort to go through and promote more of a global approach and what it is that we're doing, not just from a standpoint of liberal arts, but as it applies to different aspects of what we're teaching here at Dixie State University, something that Shadman is designing and putting together. So one of the smartest people I know, Shadman Bashir, it's your show. What do you have for us here today?
Okay. Is it working?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, my students, guest students. We are very lucky that we have Congressman Chris Stewart with us today. And for the last couple of months, we had been waiting for this moment. And I just wanted to thank Congressman personally and also how it happened. I had, in summers, when I was following the news on war and terror and all those things, I just one day wrote a letter to his office. And I just said, well, this is what I think is working, this is what's not working. And to tell you the truth, I wasn't expecting an answer. Maybe 10% that maybe someone calls me. And then I got an answer from the congressman's office, and then they said that he would like to meet me. And I was like, bingo. So we met, and when I mentioned that I have a class, and I was about to mention that, is it possible for you to come to speak to my class? He said it before even I mentioned it. So I'm really thankful to the congressman. I'm not a citizen yet. Next year I become a citizen, so I know who to vote for. Thank you very much. So Congressman is here, Congressman Stewart. Thank you very much, sir. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Shadman, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
So Eric, thank you for the invitation, and Shadman, thank you for the invitation. And when you're sworn in as a citizen, please tell me. We want to be there for that. That's a special occasion. One of my brothers is a federal judge up in Salt Lake City, and one of the coolest things I've done is be in his chambers when he swears in large groups of new U.S. citizens, and it's really very touching, and I'd love to participate in that if we could. So, interesting topic, right? War and terrorism. If you want to, stand up and just start feeling really happy and enthused and lighthearted, let's go study war and terrorism, right? And it may not be the most, lighthearted or fun topic, but is it important today? Yeah, because why? Because we live in a world that's inundated in wars or potential wars or the threat of terrorism. And it's just a different world for you than it was for me when I was growing up. When I was in college, the great threat that we faced was Russia and the great communist horde, and thinking that we'd fight this great land battle in Central Europe. Interestingly, do you know what one of the great threats we face now is Russia and fighting potential war in Eastern Europe. We'll talk about that in a little bit, as well as a couple other things. I need to share with you my background, because in order for you to understand some of the things I'm going to say to you today, you have to understand my background a little bit. Plus, it's just, I think, good for any time you start a conversation to get to know each other a little bit. And Shadman asked me to take a few minutes and tell you, things that I've done and why they may be relevant. Any of you seniors yet? A couple of you? Some of you, most of you actually. So when I was a senior in college, I thought I was going to go to law school. I come from a large family, 10 kids. You see the wings on my lapel here. These are my dad's Air Force wings. He was an Air Force pilot in World War II. I have 4 brothers that we served in the military. And being in the military was kind of deep in our family's DNA. But when I was about 16, my dad made the suggestion. I grew up farming, and we were out farming together. And he said to me, hey, Chris, I think you'd make a good pilot. You should think about going into the Air Force. And so, as a 16-year-old kid, I did what a lot of 16-year-old kids did at that time. Well, my dad thinks it's a good idea, therefore what? It's a bad idea. Yeah. And so I kind of put it out of my mind. And it was interesting because when I was young, I really, really wanted to fly. But kind of through my teenage years, I thought, no, I don't want to do that, and I don't want to serve in the military. This was back in the 70s and early 80s, and you know, back then, big hair was very groovy, right? I didn't want to get my hair cut, and I didn't want to go do the things that I thought the military was like. So I thought, you know, that's not for me. My senior year of college, I was actually preparing to start applying to law schools. And I was married, had a little boy, and I was at the time going to BYU, and my parents lived up in Logan. And I was driving up to Logan, and I drove by Hill Air Force Base, and I pulled off to the side of the road, a little rest stop there, and I watched the F-16s take off and land. And I thought, you know, that's really what I want to do. I want to fly. I want to be a pilot. And more than that, I said, I want to serve like my dad did and like my brothers have done. So I went home to my wife and said, hey, instead of going into the Air Force, going to law school, what would you think about going into the Air Force? And she said, Chris, that's a terrible idea. She didn't think that was a good idea at all, because she had never really been exposed to the military, and she didn't know what it would be like. But we did, and we served for 14 years, and I'd be out flying, and I would go, I can't believe they pay me to do this. I would do this for free. I would pay to do this. And I'm very blessed, and I really mean that. I'm very blessed to have had a career where I had a point in my life where I said, I would do this for free. And I hope you all find something that you feel that way about. And you know, with the biggest impact that my wife and I still feel about our time in the military, those 14 years, it's not the places we went, although that was great. It's not really the flying, although that was very, very cool. It's the friends that we made. And even now, you know, some of those are the dearest friends that we have. We had a kind of a saying among the pilots that I flew with that kind of developed, I don't know where it came from, but we'd say to each other, you know, hey, nothing but love, baby. And I think that was just kind of, that summed it up. You know, you just loved your brothers, and it was an honor to serve. And I got to do some cool things, actually. Shadman didn't mention this, I'll tell you. This is kind of cool. I have actually 3 world records, including the world's record for the fastest nonstop flight around the world. So I got to do some fun things. Got out of the Air Force, business owner, started writing books, which is a whole nother subject. And at one point, 4 years ago, I found myself in Congress. And the thing that I spend most of my time with now in Congress is, you know, there's so many issues that are important. I mean, you name one: regulatory reform, tax reform, entitlement reform, the election, obviously, that's so many of us are watching so closely right now. We could go down a long, long list of challenges facing our country. But what do you think is one of the greatest challenges facing us? And I'm not going to ask you to answer that, because I'm going to ask you to answer some questions in a minute. But very clearly, national security has got to be at the top of that list. After all, what is the fundamental responsibility of the federal government? It's to keep us safe. I mean, that is the primary responsibility of the federal government, is to keep us safe. And we live in a dangerous world, as we're about to talk about. And I have the privilege of sitting on the House Select Committee on Intelligence, and I hope you're familiar with that. Professor, have you discussed that a little bit? It's a really, really interesting committee. Let me give you a little background on it. For one thing, it's a very small committee. It's probably the most selective committee in Congress to be appointed to. And the process for being appointed to the committee is really quite different. Normally with the other committees, you go through this kind of they have another committee that makes those assignments. On the Intelligence Committee, that assignment is made by the Speaker and maybe 1 or 2 other people, but primarily it's the Speaker's responsibility to fill that. And it's fascinating work. I mean, I just can't begin to tell you, and we'll share some of those experiences. But it's also very important work at this time. So that, again, that's where I spend a lot of my time in Congress, is on national security and some of the issues surrounding that, and intelligence concerns. And so we normally spend about 3 weeks a month in Washington. And then 1 week a month, we get to come home to our districts and to our families and, to our constituents and our friends. And far too often that 1 week, I have to go somewhere instead of being able to come home. So in the last, 6 months or so, I've been to China, Japan, Pakistan, Russia, the Baltics, Germany, Israel, and probably a couple other places that I'm not thinking of right now. So it's a wonderful opportunity to travel the world and to talk to leaders from around the world and to work together as we try to coordinate our security, as we try to work through some of the issues that we're concerned about. So a little bit about me and my background, why we're here. Now let's talk about, subject of the class, war and global terrorism. I'd like to ask you and see what you guys think. What do you think is the greatest challenge facing our country from a security perspective right now? Greatest challenge or one of the greatest challenges? Tell me what you think. Yes, in the back. And if you don't mind, while you get the microphone passed to you, tell me your name and a little bit of your background, if you will, because I know you're a veteran and we want to recognize you.
I'm Sarah Humphreys. I'm a retired captain, Army captain. And just recent news, the DDoS attack on Friday.
Yeah.
And I see that as a threat. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
So cybersecurity?
Cybersecurity.
Huge deal. Thanks for your service, by the way. What was your branch, your MOS? Were you?
I was medical logistics officer, but I was deployed in the transportation, cross-leveled involuntarily, and was a combat logistic patrol commander.
And did you deploy? Have you got deployments?
I did.
Yeah.
Yes.
To where?
I was in the in the Sunni Triangle. I was in Ramadi, Fallujah, Najaf, Karbala.
Yeah, it's hard to watch what's happening there when you've been there and saw where we used to be. Yeah. Okay. So thank you. So cyber, we're going to come back to cyber. Let's just create a list now. What do you think are the greatest challenges or some of the challenges facing our country from a national security perspective? Yeah. Tell me your name.
My name's Jeremy Jocelyn.
Okay. And what year in school are you, Jeremy?
This is my junior year.
Okay.
Recently, Russia's claimed that the United States, through NATO, has been encircling them and acting as an aggressor towards a conflict.
Yeah.
And I would like to know your opinion on if the validity of that statement.
Okay. Great question. And I'm going to come back to your questions in just a second. Right now, I just want to list the challenges we have. But would you say Russia is one of the great challenges we have?
Russia and foreign relations with NATO.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a great point. And I got to tell you, do you all remember there's this great video 4 or 5 years ago of the administration going through the Russian reset? And remember they had this little red button they pushed, said reset. Actually turned out they'd misspelled it in Russian actually. But they showed Secretary Clinton and others saying we're going to reset our relationship with Russia. And how's that gone? Yeah. Yeah. So cyber, Russia, what other threats do we face? Yes, tell me your name if you would, please.
My name is Jacob. I'm a senior here at Dixie, and thank you for your service. My dad spent 31 years in the Marine Corps. Don't hold that against me.
Hoorah. Yeah, yeah. Look, the Marines are the real men, right? Now,
that's what he tells me.
Here's what I say about Marines. I wasn't a real man enough to go into the Marines, but I was smart enough not to go into the Marines as well. So, yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I believe perhaps financially, the debt and everything like that we face, the unfunded liabilities is staggering. It's more than I think many of us can fathom because it's many trillions. And along with that, I think our international relationship with other countries that hold our debt could potentially be a severe powder keg.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And listen, what does it take to defend our security, to defend U.S. interests around the world? It takes two things. You have to have first the will, and you have to have the means. And can you have the means to defend our nation if you are financially bankrupt? The answer to that is, of course, you can't. You have to have financial sanity at home in order to defend ourselves. So, and thank you for that point. We may come back to that one as well. All right, other threats facing our country. There's big 5 that we're looking for. We've hit a couple of them. Surely there's more. What's the one thing we read about all the time? Yeah. Tell me your name.
I'm Taylor Price. I'm
Taylor?
from Fairbanks, Alaska.
Okay.
I grew up on Eielson Air Force Base.
Okay.
And,
So your dad was an Air Force guy?
No, actually, I just lived close to the base. I just
Okay.
had a lot of military influence.
Yeah.
But I believe that the embedded terror groups within the United States is a constant threat that we should probably advise.
Oh my heavens. Well, and I think we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg on that. Yep. So we've got Russia, cyber, financial, terrorism. Any others? Still looking for 2 more that we got to understand. Threats facing our country. We got to come over this side. You guys haven't said enough. We'll put pressure on you. Any others? Yeah. Okay.
Recently, the rising conflict in the South China Sea,
Oh yes.
and the Chinese government proclaiming that Australia entering the South China Sea would be an act of war.
Yeah.
I was considering if you could see that actually giving rise to a conflict.
Well, you know what? I can see a lot of things giving rise to a conflict, actually. And let's pray that doesn't happen. But the reality is, do we think we can go the next 1,000 years without having a war? Probably not. Can we go the next 100? Probably not. I mean, it's just within the nature of man that we find ourselves in conflict sometimes. And, you know, look, I'm not predicting that. I'm certainly not advocating that. I'm just observing that often at times nations come into conflict. And especially when you have these principles in conflict. And one of them is this idea of a liberal democracy and defending that freedom and those freedoms around the world, and those who would take those freedoms away. Okay, so China, I would add one more, and that is, we got one. Yes, go ahead.
I guess like North Korea.
Yeah.
It's kind of a big deal still. So.
Kind of a big deal still. And why are they a big deal?
Well, just the nature of the government, the totalitarianism, and their secrecy to their nuclear capabilities is relatively unknown.
That's exactly right. I mean, imagine one of the most backward, devastatingly poor, totalitarian governments in the world, and yet they developed nuclear warheads. And they don't just have one. And what have we seen them do over the last 6 months? Nuclear testing, and what else? Not only nuclear warheads, ballistic missiles, including submarine launched ballistic missiles. I mean, and I'm going to come back to that in just a second. And so there's one other that I'll mention to you that we have to consider, the mullahs in Iran. And the instability between the Sunni and the Shia right now, between the Persians and the other Gulf states, and this agreement that in an effort to forestall them from developing nuclear weapons, actually just about guaranteed that they will develop nuclear weapons. It just set a timetable for them being allowed to do that. So, and I mean, in my opinion now, from my perspective on the Intel Committee, my military background, those are the big 5, and maybe 6. Cyber, Russia, China and the South China Sea, terrorism globally, and the mullahs in Iran. And I think we'll spend a little time talking about those now. So let's go through them one by one if we could. One last thing a point I want to make before we break them down a little bit. Okay, we listed 5, maybe 6. If you pick up a newspaper today, or in the last 5 or 8 years, which one of those were you the most likely to read about? Terrorism, right? Terrorism. Do you think it's the most important threat we face? Because I advocate on the committee and other public forums now all the time. I say, you know what, in my opinion, we have spent so much blood and treasure fighting this idea of terrorism that we have done it to the detriment of these other concerns. You know, in my opinion, we've kind of strained at a gnat and swallowed a camel, if you will. Because do you think, I mean, honestly, do we not think and realize the threat that Russia would be to us right now? Or a miscalculation in the South China Sea and what China's intentions are? And that's one of the things that we have to address from a national security perspective and from a policy perspective. And that is, have we balanced our resources? Have we balanced our attention to actually reflect what the threats might be? Because I can pretty much promise you that we haven't. That we spend far too much of our time and far too much of our attention and far too much of our money looking at this one threat while ignoring these other many more much larger strategic threats. And let me illustrate it through this one thing. You don't need a bunch of fighter squadrons to destroy terrorism, do you? Now, they can be helpful, and if we talk about ISIS and how we could defeat ISIS, it's going to take some air power, but it's not the only, or it's not the primary tool that you have to engage with that. But if you find yourself in a major conflict, is our power important? Absolutely. Is sea power important? Absolutely. Is infantry and the number of soldiers you can put on the ground important? Absolutely. And this is what we've done to our military, and I'll give you just one illustration. Shortly after I left the Air Force, and when we engaged in the Gulf War, in the invasion with Iraq, we had about 157 fighter squadrons. You know how many we have today? 53. Now imagine that. We've gone from 157 to about 53, maybe 56, depending on which ones are being active and a couple other considerations. And of those, about half of them are not combat capable. They're not combat ready. They don't have the ammunition, they don't have the spare parts, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the fuel and the ammunition to actually deploy and go to war. Now think about that, then ask yourself, have we adequately balanced the resources and the priorities to defend ourselves and to assure our security and our freedom? So let's break them down now. Let's start with Russia, if we could. Yeah, you want a question there?
Yes, sir. When we say we have 55, was it?
53.
53
Yeah.
fighter squadrons capable. I know in the Cold War, a lot of the escalation that actually ended up toppling the USSR was they overspent their resources on military they didn't need. If we were to have 157 squadrons of fighter units to battle, let's say, China or Russia, how many of those would actually be needed?
Well, it's a great question, and I think implied in your question is, you know, the threat of overspending, because that was your original observation is, you know, can we overspend ourselves, right? Or can we spend ourselves into bankruptcy? One of you made that point. Look, if we were to find ourselves in a major conflict with either China or Russia, or frankly, a coalition of our adversaries, perhaps in the Gulf War, or in the Gulf area, no, we need many, many more than 53. No question about it. And Captain, you're nodding your head in the back as if you agree with that, and I'm suppose that you do. And the thing is, and this will sound rather harsh, but I hope you can take it in the spirit and attend it. You don't want to go in and just have enough. You want to go in and destroy the enemy and be done with it and leave. You don't want this war to dribble out and just barely have enough to, you know, eventually win the war. You know, maybe in 2 years, maybe in 5 years, we'll eventually win. You want to go in and destroy the enemy and be finished in 6 months. That would, I think, be the primary or a much more preferable outcome. Yeah.
As it would, though. I mean, we got to look at or how much we'd be willing to spend for it. I believe last I read we were $26.2 trillion in debt as is, much of which is owned to foreign nations. And
yeah.
I mean,
yeah, and look, again, I take your point. We have to be able to pay for it, but you know, and our debt's not quite as high as you said. It's approaching 20 trillion, but it's still, you know, incredibly high. But I would go back to something I said earlier, and that is, what is the primary responsibility of our federal government? And if we can't do this, then what difference does the other stuff make? And then let me conclude your point with this, if I could, and that is, if we are strong, then we don't have to go to war. If we're strong, then we avoid a war, hopefully, because, as I said, the ability to defend ourselves comes down to our national will and our means to defend ourselves. And if our adversaries don't question that, then hopefully we avoid the war, and we don't send your age, you guys, to war, which is what all of us are trying to achieve. Let me talk about Russia for just a second and see if you guys have any thoughts on that. Do you think the reset was successful? Any thoughts on that? This happened when some of you were very young. It happened when some of you were 14, 15 years old. You weren't paying much attention to it at that point. Yes?
I think I can do it without the mic. I find it fascinating that we have Operation Anaconda going on as we speak, if I'm not mistaken, or just concluding, which is the largest NATO So to somebody's point over here, the largest NATO rally war games were next to Russia's border. And historically, we've only seen that one other time in history that I know of, and that's World War II, when the German tanks crossed the border and engaged Russia in World War II.
Yeah.
And so nobody's talking about that. Nobody even barely knows that's going on.
Yeah. So why do you think that's worth mentioning? What's your point from mentioning that?
Well, first of all, if Russia's thinking that there's a reset, that we're trying to work something out, having the largest NATO force
Yeah.
since World War II on their border is probably a provocation to them.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I can't see that as any other. If I was Russian, I'd be sitting there going, wow, are they going to send these tanks over the border like World War II to me?
Yeah.
So there's a provocation from Russia.
Okay.
So to your point, the Russians have got to be sitting there going, there's aggressiveness here that we thought was supposed to be reset, and certainly some on their side too, right?
Well-
Ukraine and.
Well, yeah, certainly some on their side. Listen, Russia they are as relentless in their propaganda. In the intelligence community, we call it active measures. They are as relentless in their active measures now as they have ever been at the height of the Cold War. And by the way, they never backed off of it, which is why Russian rebels in Donetsk region of the Ukraine can shoot down a civilian airliner. And because of Russian propaganda, a large part of the world thinks the United States did it. Because again, they're relentless in their propaganda and putting out things that just simply aren't true. And by the way, it's demonstrably untrue. I mean, there's radar and other evidence. It's very, very clear if someone wants to know the truth who did that. But I could give you example after example after example of that. I'll give you one more real quickly. Large parts of Africa have been told so consistently that Americans were responsible for the Boston bombings. And the reason we did it was because we were angry and envious of the fact that African nations and African athletes were so successful in the Boston Marathon. And so they think we did it to punish these African athletes. Look, to you and I, that's just nuts. But I'm telling you that there are millions of people around the world who've been told that so often and so long that they believe it now. And to those who would say, well, Russia considers it a provocation, I would say two things. Look at the number of soldiers involved with Operation Anaconda, and it's very clearly not an invasion force. And the second thing, and the far more important thing, is this. Give me an example of the U.S. threatening Russia. But I can give you examples of Russia threatening other nations, i.e. Crimea, i.e. Ukraine. And this last fall, I'll get to you just a second, ma'am. This last fall, a month or so ago, I was in the Baltics and Poland. And those guys are scared to death. I went to the top of this bell spire, this church spire, with the ambassador there. And he pointed just 12 or 14 kilometers across the border where you could see this mass of Russian armor. And he said, this is what we're afraid of. And we tried to assure him, hey, I think we're going to be okay. I don't think they're going to come in. He says, that's what they told us about Crimea, too. And that's what they told us about Ukraine. And by the way, Russia had now moved resources into the area south of them, into, what's the name of the Russian enclave south? I'll think of it in just a second. But anyway, it's a detached area of Russia that's south of Latvia. And they had reinforced areas there. And by the way, you know who else feels that way? Is Poland. And Poland is, we have this, there's this kind of a common phrase with the Israelis and the state of Israel where they say never again. And you know what they mean by that. We will never again allow that to happen to us. You know who else feels that way? The Poles. They look at World War II and how it impacted them. Nearly a fourth of their population, men, women, and children, were killed in World War II. And then as the Nazis are being forced out, who comes marching in? The Russians. And the Russians treated them as badly as the Germans did. And the Poles don't feel like World War II is over until Russia finally left them in early '91. And so they have this idea of never again as well. And you can understand why they'd be threatened, why they feel threatened. Yes, ma'am.
So you did pose the question, give us an example of when maybe Russia felt threatened by the U.S., I think. So you're describing a certain psychological mindset, and you're speaking as an American. You're interpreting this as an American would. And so what I'm thinking is, how does Putin, because he's Russia, he's in charge, how does he interpret Ukraine's interest in going towards the West and becoming a NATO member, for example? Well, for him, that is a threat. And he's got an illegal, negative situation on his hands in Russia, unhappy people. He's a tyrant. Okay, he is paranoid about hanging on to his power. So he's going to feel threatened by us, okay, just because we're allies with his immediate neighbors. So I think it would be helpful if we could think like Putin a little bit more and see what actually does provoke him to invade Ukraine, for example, and feel like we're, on his borders, for example. What is scary to him and how does he feel threatened by us?
Yeah.
Because I think we're getting reactions from him that we are maybe don't understand.
Yeah. Well, look, I understand your point, and I don't actually disagree with you. We have to look at this through the lens of how Vladimir Putin views this. And I think one of the questions we would ask is, what's Vladimir Putin's objective? What does he want, do you think?
Restore the Soviet Union.
That's exactly right. He wants to restore the Soviet Union, the former Warsaw Bloc countries. He wants to maintain his power. He's become one of the richest men in the world. Not bad for government work, right? But Vladimir Putin is a former KGB thug who wants to restore the power and the glory of the former Soviet Union. And he's been pretty effective at doing that, partly through proxies and others that he's put in some of the former Eastern Bloc countries, and partly through military action. But here's the moral question we're left with then. Let's take the Ukraine, or let's take Hungary, or any of these other former Warsaw Bloc countries. What if they have a democratically elected president who says, we want to associate with the West? Our values are Western thinking. The market, the economic opportunities, the chance for our children to have a better life is much more secure if we are aligned with the West than it is if we're aligned with Russia. And they are free people who make that decision by themselves. Who are we to tell them no? You can't. We won't let you do that. And yet that's what Vladimir Putin essentially wanted us to do. To take a free people and say, you can't make that decision. And that was, again, the moral quandary we were left with. Now, I understand from a Russian point of view that they viewed that, the expansion of of NATO on their borders as being threatening. I understand that. And there was no question that came with some military considerations. But at the end of the day, as Westerners, what else were we to say? No, you can't join with us. No, you can't be like us. Because that's an unacceptable solution, it seems to me. And it doesn't mean that this thing is not fraught with error all through it. It is, which is being demonstrated right now. But I think we were trying to make the best decisions in the context of where we were at that time, and I don't know how we could have done much else. How do we turn to Poland and say, no, we don't want you? How do we turn to the Ukraine and say, you're a democratically elected leader, but we don't want you. We don't care if your people want to join with, with us or not. So it's a good example of kind of the, how the answer is not always obvious. And again, you bring up a really good point. Yes?
To the point that you made about the government's primary responsibility to keep us safe, there is an ongoing discussion on citizens' own privacy and things like that. And where is the border? Where is there a balance between what the government will do in the name of safety and national security versus, Fourth Amendment, things of this nature? I wonder how you, as a legislator, think the government should and will balance that.
Again, it's a great question. It's very relevant today. If I were to ask you, I won't ask you to raise your hands, but if I were to ask you, how many of you think the government is reading your texts and your emails? A bunch of you would raise your hands. I can promise you they're not. But I can promise you that. I can look you in the eye and promise you that, and some of you won't believe me anyway. Because there's been this narrative from Edward Snowden, and by the way, he is one of the most destructive traitors our nation has ever seen. And no question about that. We worked hard on the Intelligence Committee for the last few years to release a report on Edward Snowden because we wanted the American people to know. He took something more than 1.5 million documents that had nothing at all to do with NSA. Nothing at all to do with the metadata, gathering the phone numbers. They had to do with our military hardware, they had to do with our missile systems, they had to do with our plans and our policies on defending U.S. interests around the world. They had to do with anything you can imagine, nearly, he had information. And by the way, he started stealing that stuff as soon as he got in a position where he could. And he did take some stuff on the NSA. You know, so he takes 5 or 6 documents on the NSA, then he takes, 1,499,094 other documents that have to do with our national security, and he steals them and then ends up in Russia. And I'm adamant with people when they say Edward Snowden's a hero. I said, dude, you have no idea what he did. It's cost us to date more than $2 billion to try to make some of the changes that are necessary because of the things he stole, and we're not even close to being finished with that. So putting that aside, because a lot of the basis of your question comes from Edward Snowden and his revelations about NSA. Sitting on the Intel Committee, I was one of those who advocated, the Patriot Act went too far. And here's a reason why. When we write legislation in a panic, it's almost always bad legislation. And how did we write the Patriot Act? Right after 9/11, right? And it's like, hey, we got to do something. Gosh, this is dangerous. Congress should do something. Let's pass some laws. And so we went and passed the law, and we ended up with the Patriot Act. Another example of that, kind of a different topic, Dodd-Frank, which at the end of the financial collapse, the crisis in 2008, we wrote financial industry laws, and it was just as bad and as bad of an overreach as the Patriot Act. And which is coming to your point, Captain, if you don't mind me saying that, about cybersecurity. We've been working really hard on a cybersecurity bill because we're way better to do that now than we are to wait for a cyber attack and then go write the legislation, because we will overreact once again. And we have a good cyber bill that's actually through the House and through the Senate, and I hope we get that a final version of that passed. We did the initial take this last year, but we need to do more, and I hope we have the more thorough bill sometime in the next 6 months or so. So again, I proposed and others did reforms to the Patriot Act. We passed that in the House, a little harder in the Senate, but we got it through the Senate, and the President passed it. And it was an appropriate response. It really did pull back some of the overreach of the federal government that I thought they had been doing. Yes, sir.
A quick question for you on this same area. We hear a lot about Russian cyber. WikiLeaks releases something, and everybody says it's the Russians. Is that how close to the mark is that?
I'm not going to answer specifically on that if I could, just because I have to be kind of careful what we say. That's the problem on the Intel Committee. We were very, very careful in what we say publicly, because all the time in the back of my mind I'm going, is that classified? Is that unclassified? And I don't want to be like Hillary Clinton, who became famous for having unclassified stuff that and talking about things I shouldn't have done. I will say this: there are 3 main actors on cyberspace. Russia, obviously, and their primary objective is denial of service. It's actually to damage and to influence U.S. ability to defend itself. The second great actor, do y'all know? China. That's right. What's China's primary objective? Is it to harm us? Not necessarily. What is it? That's right. They want to steal stuff. And they've stole billions and billions of dollars worth of stuff. And they're very, very good at it. Third actor, Iran. And they're very good at it as well. Since you asked about Russia, the interesting thing about Russia and the Chinese, well, actually all of them, anyone who's doing this, is their partnerships with criminal elements, and how they build these relationships. It gives them kind of non-attribution. Oh, it wasn't us. It was those criminals over there. Well, those criminals are working in your buildings. They're many times being paid by you, and they're using your computers. Yeah, but it wasn't us. It was those criminals over there. And it gives them kind of a little bit of a firewall between them, so they can say, hey, it wasn't us. You got to talk to those other guys. But those three actors are very, very good at it. Now, did they do WikiLeaks? Again, I really can't comment on that. But I will say this as an example of our fears with them. I was in Moscow last summer, And when I came home, I did some media interviews, and one of the things I mentioned, and it was kind of an offhand way, but it kind of caught on, and so I ended up doing a lot of media about it, was I said, I'm worried about Russia interfering with our presidential elections. Well, that wasn't because I'd had any specific threats or specific briefings on that. It was just a common sense conclusion because they had done it in Ukraine, they'd done it in Norway, they'd done it in several other Western European nations. And so with the, kind of tenacious and bickering and the back and forth of American politics right now, it just seemed to me this would be something that would be helpful to them if they tried to do that. And I was asked by the media after that saying, well, is it because they want Donald Trump to win? I said, no, I don't think they care at all who wins. What they want is to just erode the foundation of our democracy, erode our faith in those institutions that we have to accept, when one of those is being a free and a fair election. And if we don't believe our elections are actual free, and if we don't believe they're fair, then overnight it erodes that kind of faith in our government. And by the way, it weakens the next president to a large degree if you can tell the story that the Russians had manipulated the election. And I think that's what they were going after if they did interfere with that.
So when the dialogue was exposed that the DNC had somewhat had a hand in eschewing the elections away from Bernie Sanders, are you saying that, would that be, would Russia have a hand in, making that dialogue up, or would that have actually happened?
Is there evidence that Russia fabricated those emails?
Or is the American government, or is the DNC, it's not the government, is the DNC somewhat responsible for that, would you say?
Well, I don't. Although Hillary and others have hinted that, and her campaign chairman, who has thousands and thousands of emails out there, they've kind of hinted or wanted people to believe that those emails were fabricated, but there's no evidence at all that they were. Almost everyone accepts. In fact, I don't know anyone on the national stage who has not said these are not authentic emails. It's too easy to go and prove that if they were or not. So they've never really tried to say, no, they've made this up or they've doctored the emails. They've objected to them doing it, obviously, but I don't think anyone has said that they've been manipulated. Was that your question? Was that what you were asking?
Maybe in the sense that a sixth or seventh point to be a threat to national security would be the loss of American confidence in politics.
Yeah. Because
of corruption such as the DNC.
Well, then, yeah, and so there's no question that that was one of their objectives in releasing that email. And now you'd have to go talk to Mr. Assange and WikiLeaks to understand, what their motives were. And by the way, it's in fairness, 3 or 4 years ago when they were releasing things that were harmful to the Republican side or conservatives, the Democrats loved WikiLeaks and the Republicans hated them. And now they're releasing information that's damaging the Democrats, and the Democrats, and the Republicans have flipped their view on that right now. Okay, all right. Was there any other comments before we move on? Any other questions? Okay, I want to hit on a couple things, just I think quickly in the time we have remaining. One of them is my worries in the South China Sea, and you have this remarkable event taking place there that I think you all have studied. And if not, you're aware of it, just I would hope from reading the newspaper, where China has claimed inside other nations' exclusionary zones, inside the traditional 200-mile border that they would consider their territory, and they've taken some sandbars that are no bigger than this room, and they've dredged and they've created from that 2,000 and 3,000 acre military bases. They have runways. They have hangars, have fuel storage, have generators, billeting, all of the facilities you need to host a military installation. And it's very clearly illegal what they've done. So when I was in China last spring, we asked him about that because at the time, the Philippines had filed suit, although it's not really filed suit, but we'll use that phrase because it'll help us understand it better. They'd filed a claim in the international court saying, hey, China has infringed on our sovereign territory. They are just outside our borders. We need your help to enforce this. And when I was in China last spring, we asked about that, and they said, we don't care what the world court finds. We're going to ignore their finding regardless. And they just simply didn't care. So how did the World Court find in June? Do you remember? They found for the Philippines. They said, yes, China is breaking international law. China has infringed on sovereign territory of the Philippines, and by the way, about half a dozen other countries as well. And the Philippines, you know what they did? Nothing. And in fact, if you've watched over the last couple of weeks, what has the president of Philippines done? He's just got back from a 4-day trip to China, where he said essentially, you know what, we're not partners with the US anymore. We're not going to have any more military alignments with them. We're not going to have any more military exercises with them. And economically, we're going to turn to China. Why did they do that? They won. They were in a position of superior legal authority. They could have enforced this, but they didn't. And the answer is really important for us to recognize. And that is the Philippines and some other nations there as well have looked strategically at the world and they said, you know what, we don't know if the United States is going to be an important part of this region in the future. But we know China is. And it may be that it's in our long-term interest, it may be the only way we survive, is to align ourselves with China and to begin to sever or diminish our relationship with the United States. That is a remarkable event that's taken place in the last 6 months. It changes the dynamics in remarkable ways, and things we haven't seen since the end of World War II, really. So you have the president of the Philippines, who's a little bit of a, I don't know what, this being broadcast, I'll be careful how I describe him, but look, he's a little bit of a character at least. Some of the things he said are just absolutely nutty. But he's not stupid. And he went to China and said, we're your partner now. And we're going to begin to sever our relationship with the United States. And they're not the only nation that's thinking that. In my travels with the intel community, I can't tell you how often I hear national leaders say essentially the same thing. Where is the United States? We don't know if we can count on you anymore. We don't know if you're going to be there for us like you have been for the last 60 years. We don't know if you're a reliable partner. And the next president, whoever it's going to be, is going to have an enormous challenge rebuilding some of those alliances that have been brought into question over the last few years. And it's incredibly important, in my opinion, that the next president does that, including some of our traditional allies like Israel, the only democracy in a very, very troubled part of the world, the only democracy that honors women's rights and the rights of minorities and the rights of minority religions, the only democracy that has a peaceful transition of governments. And we have them and others who are looking at us, and they are also forced now to relook at some of their alliances. Why? Because Vladimir Putin has been brilliant in what he did in Syria. And he's interjected himself there in a way that will allow him to have a presence that they've wanted since 1947, since the creation of the State of Israel. And they have been precluded from having that physical presence, and now they're there. And so they're building a great military installation there. They've got a warm water port in the Mediterranean, and they have no intention of giving that up. When I say they, I mean the Russians. And so it forces all of those neighbors now in that area to deal with them, and they haven't had to do that in the past.
I have another question about the capability Russia actually has of waging a traditional war. I've read recently and heard news reports, I guess, of a declining population and an unstable population within Russia itself. The birth rate is not high enough, as is right now, to maintain their population. And with the majority of the young men being casualties in another great war, could they actually afford that? Or maybe are they playing kind of a dog with a lot of bark and little bite?
Again, it's a good question. Russia's not the only nation that's finding a real demographic challenge right now. Not the only nation with declining populations. Who's leading the world in declining populations? All of Europe. And by the way, they are our allies. So any problem that Russia has with that, Europe has it worse, and it's something that we have to deal with in both circumstances. Again, I'm not predicting, and I'm not advocating that I think this will likely happen. I'm not saying we're going to find ourselves in a war with Russia. I'm saying we need to face the possibility that we could. And are we in a position to defend ourselves? Russia's made remarkable achievements in 5th-generation fighter technology, for example, as has China. How did China do that? Because they stole it from us, by and large. Now, they're not quite as good as ours. So, for example, the F-35, there's really nothing the Russians have built that's as good as the F-35, but they build a lot more of them. It's really the same strategy they used during the height of the Cold War. We'll just blow you away with numbers. We're going to have more armor, we're going to have more tanks, we're going to have more artillery, we're going to have more fighters. They won't be as good, but if we go 4 against 1, we'll take our chances on that. But yeah, there's no question that Russia has some demographic challenges. They do. You know, though, did you know that they've doubled their spending in military since 2012? Just since 2012, they've doubled the amount they've spent in military. Let me see if there's anything else that anyone else has got questions or comments we have, and then we're going to wrap this up, I think. Yeah. Okay. Any more? All right, sir. We'll give you the last word.
I don't know. So when they've doubled their spending, I've heard that America's has a larger spending percentage than the top or the next 5 countries combined on the list below.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, are we still like what 2.5 times their amount as it is?
Yeah. The problem with that is you can't look at the dollars spent because you're comparing dollars to rubles, and you're also comparing what will a ruble buy. Because it turns out 10 rubles in Russia will buy a lot more than $10 in the United States. So to look at the actual numbers that are spent isn't a very fair comparison. What you have to look at is how many aircraft do they have? What are the capabilities of the aircraft? How many soldiers do they have? What are the capabilities of the soldiers? How many tanks do they have? And you go down that list. And they've become a respectable military force once again. 1991, they were incredible for us. They let some of that slip away, as did we over the ensuing 20 years. But they committed, as are the Chinese once again, to building a very capable, modern military force. All right, well, listen, it's been good to take a few minutes with you. I appreciate your questions. You've got some thoughtful questions. You got some probing questions. I know that in this kind of academic environment, some of you agree with some of the things I've said. Some of you may disagree with some of the things I've said, but that's why this is a good time for you to kind of explore those things. Now, here's the one thing that I hope that we can all agree on. And you know what? If we can't agree on this, then I don't know what to say to you. And that is, the United States has an incredibly important role in the world. We may not want it. We may not seek it. It may not be something that we look or hope to have, but it's just the truth. The United States has an incredibly important role in the world. What would have happened in the last century if we wouldn't have had a united United States? And the good that has come and the freedoms that have been shared, not with the entire world, but with large parts of the world, because the United States was willing to do some of the things that we did. And I'll end with this. I had a recent conversation with an ambassador from Australia. And he's one of the most brilliant men that I've ever talked with. And he made the point, and I wish I could say it as well as he did, but I'm going to paraphrase it. He said, the United States is the most benevolent country in the history of the world. He said, there's never been another country that was willing to say and sacrifice like the United States. And he said, for example, the Russians had the ability to kill every man, woman, and child on earth. And the United States said, before you kill them, you have to kill us. Before you take away their freedoms, you have to take away our freedoms first. Because we will stand as an umbrella over these other nations, and we will defend their freedoms with our own citizens. And I challenge any of you to find me another country in the history of the world that's done that has held themselves ransom for the freedom and for the well-being of other countries. So we got some challenges: terrorism, potential war, global conflict. We may see some of that. We may see some more of that. But the United States is, I think we're capable of defending ourselves. And if we make the right decisions, I think we'll always be able to maintain that capability. So, Professor, thank you for giving me time to be with you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Congressman. Well said.
Thank you for joining us for this broadcast. Be sure to join us on Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock Mountain Standard Time for Talking Point Live with myself and my colleague Jen Kohler. For the Community Education Channel, I'm Eric Young. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.